So again, it's too nice of a day outside. I had to move outside right now. So we'll be handling at least part 3 of this video series from my backyard. You can see I have spectators. Yeah, there they are. Oh, don't run away from me, Dee Dee. And say hello. Say hi, Leaky. Right? So, got some fans. Right? All right. So, we're going to talk about total war in this segment of the video, which was a concept that had not before been used in war, except possibly, some elements were involved in the Civil War in America and whatnot, but World War I was really the full realization of this concept of total war. And as such, it's worth talking about because it really kind of defines what this war is going to be all about, right? Especially for the people not involved directly in the fighting. So let's talk about total war, right? Total war is, if you think about it, what it sounds like, right? War that is total. It is involving the total population of your country, and your enemy is targeting your entire total population. So you are devoting the totality of your resources towards winning the war, and your enemy is targeting the totality of those resources. That means that you have soldiers that are fighting and civilians at home who are supporting those soldiers, and both groups are being targeted by your enemy, right? So you have the military front, the people that are out there fighting the war, but you have the development of a new front in the war that was called the home front. Those people that were supplying your soldiers from home with the materials they needed, keeping your country going during wartime, and which unfortunately were the targets of attacks during this war. You're going to see that strategy employed even more strongly during World War II, when civilians were bombed incessantly. Hundreds of thousands of civilians, non-soldiers, complete innocents, died in World War II. That practice begins with the total war in World War I. And you can see, I've included a quote here from the American president during the war, Woodrow Wilson. We're saying that those people who are working to support the soldiers, the people who are providing food and resources for them, they are no less valuable than the soldiers who are out there fighting the war and losing their lives fighting it as soldiers, right? So during the war, what did total war entail? If you were a country, let's just take a country, let's just say France, right? Let's just say France. If you're France, what is your country doing that's different during total war than what they would do normally? There are some main differences that we talk about here on this slide. One, conscription, which is the fancy word for a military draft. During World War I, there was a need to have a draft for all countries involved, and the reasons for that are there are a couple, right? One is because although there was a huge support for the war in the beginning in 1914, by the time 1916 rolls around, when you're in the middle of the war, support for it has dropped dramatically. People aren't signing up to die anymore. The home countries have lost hundreds and thousands, if not millions of people at this point from each belligerent nation. And people are not going to sign up for that anymore. So you've got to get soldiers coming by force. And at the same time, if you implement a draft, it means that the government gets to choose who goes. And that means that people who have expertise in an area that's needed, or they do a job that you can't afford to lose, then the government won't choose those people to go, right? So if you are, I don't know, if you own a business, a small business, let's say, that could be of use to the government during this wartime, but you want to go, they're not going to choose you because they need you to produce. Speaking to that effect, you've got government control of the economy, which I here call nationalization of the economy. What that means is the government's basically telling people how to operate their business instead of letting people operate their business freely, as they typically would have been able to do in a country like France or England, and to a lesser extent in Germany and Russia. During wartime, the government basically took full control of those businesses, especially those businesses that would be of use to the war front, which was basically everything, right? So the government's going to tell you what to make, how much of it to make, how much to pay your workers, how many workers to hire, who to hire, everything. The government took control of everything. And as a result, you had basically the entire country holding a job. There was virtually no unemployment whatsoever, because everyone was either a soldier or working to support the soldiers. That meant that many more women than had previously been the case were employed, and those women were employed in jobs that had never been before open to them. Old people had to work. Younger people than would typically be working had to work. Everything, right? And the last thing I have here is propaganda. And propaganda kind of happens in a couple different ways. If we think about propaganda and we give it a broad definition, we could say that propaganda is media that is used to convince you to believe something, usually something that is either exaggerated or just flat out not true. And it's often associated with wartime. And you'll see why in a second, because there are really two ways that propaganda is used. One, to make you believe that your country is doing better than it actually is, right? So that would involve censoring the news, perhaps not releasing how many people are actually dying, perhaps exaggerating the degree of your success, perhaps exaggerating the degree to which your enemy is losing. And propaganda is used in a second way, and that is to portray your enemy as a true monster, as someone far worse than they actually are. Now, if you look at your normal soldier, right? Most soldiers are just normal people who signed up because they believe in their country, right? Most individual soldiers are not terrible people. And it didn't really matter where you were from. You know, your average British soldier was a normal person. Your average German soldier was a normal person. Your average Russian, Austrian soldier, normal person. But it is hard to fight against a normal person because they're just like you, right? So propaganda has to make your enemy look like a monster, make your enemy look like a subhuman creature who is committing evil and atrocity and making the world a bad place. So that's how it's used. Let's see, is this going to work here? All right, so here on this slide we have examples of what total war looked like in each country. I'm not going to go through there and go through those specific details because that would just take too much time, but I would recommend that you read those just for a material example. And during the war, during the course of this total war, people became increasingly negative towards both the war itself and towards the government's handling of it, right? Because necessarily when you have the government controlling things, that is going to restrict your freedom as a business owner, restrict your freedom as a purveyor of the news. You know, if you want to read and access the truth from a newspaper, you're not going to be able to do that anymore. You're not going to have the freedom to take off from work, even things like that. You're not going to have the freedom to buy what you want because the government's only going to allow you to buy certain things, certain types of food, certain amounts of food, things like that, in order to produce for the soldiers. So by the midpoint in the war in 1916, you've got civilians being quite upset with the war. You could see, and I can't really see my mouse because I'm outside and it's kind of bright, but at two different points in 1916 and then later in 1917, you have two examples of rather large German strikes. The first involving 50,000 and the next in 1917 involving 200,000 German workers refusing to work for a variety of reasons. In the first case, because of a government official. In the second case, because they were sick and tired of being told how much bread they could buy. And you could see the degree to which the strikes are increasing, right? You go from 50,000 the first year to a 200,000 person strike in the next. And that's just in one country. It was more or less the same in other countries, maybe not to the same extent, but people going on strike, refusing to work, refusing to provide for the war effort because they're dissatisfied with what the government is doing. You have criticism from both sides. You've got liberals, you've got socialists, you've got conservatives. Everyone's kind of criticizing the government. It's hard to be in government during a time of crisis for sure. And in response to these protests, these strikes, governments are just going to be more heavy-handed. Even in countries that are typically leaning towards democracy, or if not just full-on, freedom of speech when things aren't in war, countries like England and France, you have those same countries, England and France, enacting things like the Defense of the Realm Act, which basically said that if you protest the war, we can put you on trial as a traitor. And being a traitor carries the death penalty in most times, right? In France, it's going to be much the same. Freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, freedom of expression in any way that you shake it is going to be put on pause during this war. And if you express yourself in a way that the government disagrees with, well, you're going to face legal consequences for that. And that's something that the governments were criticized for doing. How did total war impact society? As mentioned before, because the government's taking control of production and because people are either away soldiering or producing for the war, unemployment virtually disappears. And as mentioned before also, a large body of that non-soldier employment was handled by women. Women were employed in new roles. For example, women, I have here, took up a much larger role in banking. Obviously, countries need banking to survive during a war because you need money to be lent. You need people to be able to keep their savings and take out loans during this difficult time. You need banks not to collapse. So you see that from before the war to during the war, women in England alone went from like 9,500 to 64,000 in banking. Unfortunately, though, once the war ended, the number of women in jobs was diminished significantly. When the men who were soldiers came back from the war, they were given first priority in terms of jobs, and you could see that after the war, it says post-war return, 650,000 women lost their jobs, and those women that were retained in their positions lost money in order to give higher wages to men, which, it's a pretty terrible result, and something that women today are still unfortunately dealing with. I believe it's still the case that women in the United States are earning 75 cents to every dollar that a man makes. But that's something we've still got to deal with. But there was a positive result for women in most countries involved in the war, and that was that women, because of their service, really their desire to have the right to vote could no longer be ignored. Right? How could you deny women the right to vote, to participate in democracy, to participate in voting when they had served the countries that they served so well? So after World War I, you have a blaze of different countries going out and giving women the right to vote. England, Germany, Austria-Hungary, the United States, they're all going to get the right to vote pretty much as soon as World War I ends. And that's where this video is going to end. Short one right here, right? That's where that video is going to end. We're going to have a fourth installment, technically the fifth video, detailing the peace process and all the stuff going on there. So I'll be bringing that to you right now. as soon as I hit escape and start a new video. So see you guys in a second.